Let me tell you something about the Galactic Accord Summit. Every species in the known universe spent decades, sometimes centuries, preparing for it. The Vorkai polished their ceremonial spine plates for 3 generations. The Lumindra practiced their diplomatic throat songs for 40 years. The Thesovian High Council rewrote their opening statement no fewer than 800 times. And the humans? The humans showed up 12 minutes late, carrying what they called, quote, snacks. I am Greth Malun, senior diplomatic recorder for the Collective of 7 Moons. And I was there. I saw everything. Every single humiliating galaxy-altering moment of it. And if the Council ever releases me from mandatory therapy, I will tell you exactly how it happened. The summit was held aboard the Eternal Ring Station, a structure so massive that 17 civilizations contributed to its construction, and only 9 of them could agree on where to put the bathrooms. The main chamber seated 400 delegates from 62 species. The seating chart alone had taken 11 years to negotiate. Every chair placement carried political weight. Every table angle whispered alliance or insult. The Vorkai sat at the front because they had the largest military. The Lumindra sat second because they controlled the most trade routes. It went on like that. A perfectly engineered display of interstellar power, ranked and arranged like a monument to everything that mattered in this galaxy. Then the humans walked in and sat in the back row. The back row. Nobody sat in the back row. The back row was where we had placed the emergency seating for species who had not yet been granted full delegate status. It had no nameplates. It had no translation consoles. It had a partially broken temperature regulator, and one of the chairs had a wobble that maintenance had been promising to fix for 6 years. The humans looked at it, looked at each other, and sat down like they had reserved those seats specifically. Ambassador Tovak-Threnn of the Vorkai actually stopped mid-sentence to stare. Tovak-Threnn had personally overseen the destruction of 4 rebel star systems. He was not a being who got distracted easily, but he stood there, jaw plates hanging open, watching the human delegation unpack what appeared to be small bags of salted and fried plant material, and pass them cheerfully down the row. "Are those creatures comfortable?" he whispered to his aide. His aide had no answer. Nobody had an answer. I was seated in the recorder's booth above the chamber floor, stylus already shaking in my hand. This was not in the schedule. Schedule had been final. The schedule had been sacred. I looked down at my notes and then back at the humans, and I thought, very quietly, that I might need to start a new document. The session opened with the standard Accord formalities, which take approximately 3 hours and involve each delegation standing in sequence to recite their civilization's formal titled territorial claims, and a brief summary of their contributions to galactic advancement. The Vorkai declared their military achievements. The Lumindra listed 17 pharmaceutical discoveries. The Thesovians described their mathematical contributions in detail that made 2 smaller delegations visibly fall asleep. When it was the human delegation's turn, their ambassador, a short, relaxed-looking individual named Petra Woss, stood up from the back row, brushed something off her jacket, and said, "We are the humans. We are from Earth. We figured out how to boil water about 10,000 years ago, and we have been making increasingly questionable decisions ever since. We are pleased to be here." She sat back down. There was a silence so complete that I could hear the broken chair wobbling. Then she stood back up. "Also, we brought food if anyone wants some. It is a corn-based product. It is quite good." She sat down again. Councillor Brevom of the Thesovians, a being who had personally authored 30 diplomatic treaties and had never in his life shown a visible emotion, turned to look at me from across the chamber. He had the expression of someone who had just watched a moon crack in half and was still waiting to understand what that meant for the weather. I wrote in my notes, "Something is wrong," or "Something is right. I cannot tell yet." The formal agenda was supposed to proceed to territorial boundary negotiations, which had been the central crisis of the last 2 decades. The Vorkai wanted expansion rights into the outer spiral corridors. The Lumindra wanted trade monopolies on 3 emerging star systems. The Thesovians wanted everyone to stop building weapons near their observatories. It was the same argument that had been running for 23 years, and everyone in that room had come prepared to have it again with slightly different words. The lead Vorkai negotiator, a warrior diplomat named Gorvak-Threnn, stood and began the opening argument. He had been rehearsing it for 4 years. It was aggressive, precise, and built like a weapon itself. Each clause was designed to corner a different opponent. He delivered the first 6 sentences with the calm confidence of someone who knows they have already won. And from the back row, Ambassador Petra Woss said, very pleasantly, "Sorry, quick question. Who actually benefits from the outer spiral expansion? Like specifically, which populations?" Gorvak-Threnn stopped. Not because the question was rude. It was not rude. It was asked in the tone of someone genuinely curious. Someone who had simply walked in from outside and wanted to understand the situation before forming an opinion. That was the problem. Nobody at this summit had asked that question. Not once. In 23 years of negotiations, not a single delegate had stood up and said, "Who does this actually help?" Because everyone already knew the answer, and nobody wanted to say it out loud. The chamber went very, very quiet. I stopped writing and looked at the humans in the back row. Petra Woss was looking at Gorvak-Threnn with an expression of patient, mild curiosity. Her colleagues were eating their corn product. I wrote 3 words in my notes and underlined them twice. They are dangerous. Gorvak-Threnn was not a being who panicked. He had negotiated the silence pact of the Korev belt. He had stared down the Lumindra trade armada without blinking a single one of his 4 eyes. He had once sat through a 17-hour interrogation by the Soviet legal scholars and emerged without conceding a single clause. But Petra Woss had asked him a question so simple that answering it honestly would unravel everything. And answering it dishonestly in front of 400 delegates with active translation consoles would be worse. So he did what every powerful diplomat does when cornered by something they did not expect. He talked about something else entirely. The expansion benefits the stability of the galactic corridor infrastructure, he said, very smoothly, which in turn supports the collective economic framework of all member civilizations. Petra Woss nodded slowly. Then she said, "Right, yes. But I looked at the corridor maps last night, and the populations closest to those expansion zones are mostly the Drevari settlements. Do the Drevari want to be absorbed into Vorkai territory?" Another silence, longer this time. The Drevari delegation was seated in the middle rows, which meant they were important enough to not be ignored but not powerful enough to be feared. They were a quiet species, careful. They had been attending these summits for 30 years and had never once been directly referenced by name in an opening argument. Every head in the chamber turned toward them. The Drevari head delegate, a small, silver-skinned being named Orvesa Tull, looked like she had just been handed something extremely fragile and extremely unexpected. She straightened slowly in her chair. She looked at Gorvak-Threnn. She looked at Petra Woss. She looked at her own hands. Then she said, very quietly, but with a translation console that carried her voice to every corner of the chamber, "No, we do not." The sound that followed was not quite an uproar. It was more like the moment before an uproar, when every species in the room recalculates everything simultaneously, and the air gets heavy with the weight of shifting positions. I was gripping my stylus so hard that it snapped cleanly in 2. Gorvak-Threnn turned to look at the back row with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has just realized they stepped onto a bridge that was not actually there. Below that, Petra Woss smiled at him pleasantly. It was the kind of smile that had no edges and no threat, and was somehow more alarming than either. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "I just like to understand who we are talking about before we decide things about them. Please continue." But Gorvak-Threnn could not continue. Not from where he had started. The outer spiral expansion argument had been built on the assumption that nobody would question whose land was actually being discussed. Now the Drevari were on record. Now 400 delegates were looking at the corridor maps with new eyes. The whole structure of his argument had been built on a silence that Petra Woss had simply politely and cheerfully refused to observe. He sat down. It was the first time in 23 years of summit history that the Vorkai opening argument had not been completed. Councillor Brevom of the Thesovians looked at me again from across the chamber. His expression had changed. He no longer looked confused. He looked like a mathematician who has just watched someone solve an equation by doing something technically valid but completely outside the accepted method. He looked, if I am being honest, impressed. The session broke for the midday interval, which was supposed to last 40 minutes. It lasted 3 hours because half the delegations needed emergency strategy meetings. The corridors outside the main chamber were filled with the sounds of frantic whispered consultations in 26 different languages. The Lumindra trade attaché walked past me 4 times without appearing to notice where she was going. Two junior Vorkai aides were having what appeared to be a quiet argument about whose fault this was. I found a corner and wrote 14 pages of notes without stopping. When the session resumed, something had shifted. The seating arrangement was technically the same. The name plates were in the same positions. The Vorkai still sat at the front, but the weight of the room had moved. Somehow, without changing chairs, the gravitational center of that chamber had migrated to the back row, where 4 humans were sitting with terrible posture in an almost empty bag of corn product. The Lumindra representative, High Trader Sennova-Kell, stood to present the trade monopoly proposal. She was brilliant. Her argument was layered and precise and had 17 backup positions prepared for every possible counterargument. Before she could deliver the third sentence, Petra Woss raised her hand. Sennova-Kell stopped. Nobody raised their hand at the Galactic Accord Summit. You waited to be recognized by the chair. You followed the speaking protocol that had been established over 60 years of procedural refinement. Petra Woss had her hand up like she was trying to ask a question in a classroom. The chair, an ancient Solarian named Vedros Pen, stared at the raised hand for a long moment, then apparently deciding that the day could not get stranger, recognized her. Ambassador Woss. You have a query? Just one, Petra said. The 3-star systems in the monopoly proposal, those are the Felari systems, right? The ones where the new agricultural colonies are just getting established. That is correct, Sennova-Kell said carefully. So if the trade monopoly goes through now before those colonies are self-sufficient, they would be locked into Lumindra pricing structures before they have any leverage to negotiate on their own behalf. Every agricultural colony delegate in the room went very still. That is, Sennova-Kell began. A considerable oversimplification of a nuanced economic framework. Yes or no is fine, Petra said. It was not fine. It was catastrophic, because the answer was yes and everyone knew it, and now everyone was waiting to see if the High Trader of the Lumindra was going to say it out loud in front of 400 witnesses. Sennova-Kell did not say it out loud. She said instead that perhaps certain provisions could be revisited, perhaps a phased implementation might be considered, perhaps a working group, which was in the language of this summit, complete and total surrender. By the end of that session, the Vorkai expansion had been suspended pending Drevari consultation. The Lumindra monopoly had been sent back for restructuring. The Thosevian observatory protection clauses, which had been ignored for 9 years, had been quietly moved to the priority agenda. All of it had happened because one human, sitting in a broken chair in the back row, kept asking simple questions that nobody had thought to ask before. Or rather, questions that everyone had thought to ask but had agreed, through years of careful diplomatic habit, never to say out loud. After the session ended, Gorvak-Threnn walked to the back row. He stood in front of Petra Woss for a long moment. You did not argue, he said. You did not threaten. You did not present a counter-proposal. No, Petra agreed. Then what was your strategy? Petra folded the empty snack bag neatly and tucked it into her jacket pocket. She looked up at him with that same expression of mild, genuine interest that had been dismantling his civilization's plans all afternoon. We just asked who was not in the room, she said. And then we made sure they were. She stood, stretched, and walked out. I sat in the recorder's booth for a long time after the chamber emptied. I looked at my 22 pages of notes. I looked at the back row with its broken chair still wobbling slightly in the recycled station air. Then I wrote the final line of my official record for the day. The humans brought snacks. They did not need anything else.